Um, I'm trying to think of what could be the most general question as well as the most specific question. And, just before the camera started rolling, you were talking about sites, and then you called the sites that you went to the arcane site, and which is really kind of interesting adjective that you're using. But maybe I'll ask two-pronged questions that, the process in which you brought this about into this physical form involved you traveling to those arcane sites. And if you could describe a little bit about the travel from that place, to this particular site. And also because it meant a kind of a transition from performing arts space to the gallery. So, if you could start maybe unfolding a little bit what the site means to you in relation to this work, that would be.
Well, I think the iteration or the mediation, and it's about both. So in a sense, they're cycling back and forward within one another. The rural site. I don't know if I would describe it as arcane. Maybe right. In that it's my being there and its relationship to me is very particular and foreign and somewhat strange. And highly charged.
Right.
In the mythology that I bring to it. I feel that, part of me feels that sort of Walter and his landscape doesn't belong in this space. And so mediating it and bringing it to this space, creates an interesting kind of conflict for me and the discussions I'm having with, the material of it.
Right. Right.
Like authenticity comes up. A rural landscape, in a real live, 100-year-old human being who has, I suspect never been in a museum space in his life.
Right.
And probably will never be at the Walker.
Right.
And who hasn't seen this exhibit. A work that's all about him through my lens. So I think my bringing it to the Walker in this space is about asking some questions of myself.
Right. Right.
In an environment that I'm familiar with. So I've had a life that's about the stage and the politics of performance, but I also understand to some extent the politics of this kind of space, the visual art gallery setting. And I think this work was pretty much constructed and sculpted for this environment and not for a performance. Theatrical architecture.
Right.
Audience.
Well, when you talk about mediation, that also reminds me of one description for the work before the work existed. And, you said something about your relationship with Walter explores that kind of precarious distinction between interaction and exploitation. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, that precarious relationship there you were exploring with Walter, and that relationship with how you're mediating the space for the audiences. So, it's almost kind of triangular relationship you're setting up here. It's not just about, because you made it into a physical space where people are enveloped. And I think the one descriptor that you gave was socio-atmospheric questions, which I thought was really beautiful. And really, like in the atmospheric way, you really kind of envelope with images and sounds. So it seems like there's one further level of mediation that you had to think about.
Well, that also begins with some perceived notion I have that Walter represents that. the socio. Does he really? You know, he's just a human being like any other that sort of travels through this space.
Right.
But getting back to this idea of, you know, exploitation and engaging and the tension, and I think again it's something that, you know, a lot of this work is about what I'm perceiving it to be. The questions it brings up are my questions, they aren't Walter's questions. I'm not sure if I can answer its exploitation potential. You know, I'm not sure I'm exploiting Walter. I don't know if he cares. I doubt, you know, there's part of me that feels like he may not even know what that means.
Right.
You know, that he is a human being with a certain amount of power, especially given that he's an elder. You know? And so if anyone's being exploited, it might be me also. You know? He's not a babe. He knows his relationship to whatever's happening between us. But what I'd like to sort of talk about within this larger question that you asked is, I wonder how much I'm exploiting the audience of a space like this that comes to watch this. And when I think about it, it's like I'm absolutely exploiting them, you know, because there's certain ideas and tropes I'm working with that are manipulative, maybe not clear. But I also feel like my immediate response to that is I don't care about that exploitation. Whereas I do think about and think there's a part of me that does care, even if I can't articulate it, about the issue of exploitation with Walter. Why?
Right.
You know?
Right.
I think, some basic need to protect that. And maybe because I don't really know what that is, you know? Again, some presumption that it's kind of sacred space. The rural, you know, the South, a ground zero for Black American experience. Walter, this 100-year-old man, you know. I think there's a lot of romance and nostalgia going into my work with him.
Right.
I don't think that's a bad thing.
What was really remarkable about working with you to bring together this installation was that you were both very meticulous and controlling about all the elements, but also you were incredibly open to the rest of the space. You know, I think from the very beginning, we knew that there would be two large physical presences here. You know, Rickard's stage and your post stage, and then you were insisting that there needs to be integration. You know, so you were not only concerned about securing you know, certain light and sound situation, but also you were thinking about Rickard's stage and how perhaps it should be oriented so that there is an integration. So, you know, that was really remarkable that, you know, you were thinking about the vectors of forces within your space, but you were also thinking about how it opens out to the rest of the space. Now that it happened, how do you feel? I mean, was it successful? And, you know, were there any meanings and significances that you didn't anticipate, but now you see?
Well, I don't want this to sound like it comes from my ego, because I'm involved in this, but I think this is one of the most interesting gallery exhibits I've experienced. In the questions it brings up about ownership and object and audience, you know? And I suspect a lot of that appreciation comes from a certain kind of naivete in my relationship to, you know, the sort of museum aesthetic, you know.
What do you mean by naivete?
Well, the preciousness of the object. I'm not sure if I really understand that, other than what I bring to what I think that is, or my relationship to going into a museum space and seeing these untouchable, you know, objects and materials. And as an artist, I know that a lot of that stuff comes from a very messy, sometimes damaged,
Right.
unkempt often, kind of riotous, creative process experience. But once it's brought into a space like this, it becomes
Refined.
much more refined.
Yeah.
And is that true to what is really happening? So I have always seen that as kind of a conflict. And I feel like that what happened here in this space is and we talked about this, is you opened up that discussion about what is an object and what is precious and what is available, for an audience to experience outside of the artist's experience of whatever it was he was working on,
Right.
in the creation of something.
Right.
So I feel the room is full of tension and
Confusions.
there's an orderliness to it. It has a logic
I tried.
that I understand.
Yes.
That I understand.
Right.
And maybe it's because I'm involved in it, but it's also a big logic, that contradicts, I think, a kind of tradition. So I think it's extremely successful from my point of view, and not because it looks good.
Right.
I feel like it's not about that, and I feel like Rikrit's piece was really key. That there's this giant mammoth thing in the middle of the space. Still, and we talked about that.
Yeah.
Like, it can't be in the middle of the space. I need some room.
Yeah.
Still, it's kind of in the middle of the space.
Oh, yeah.
And yet, I think he came in with, his aesthetic, which is, I'm building this thing, and it's for, you do whatever,
Right.
you do with it what you want. And you made the decision to close the top off,
Yeah.
right? So it's loaded with a kind of battle of agendas that I think then marks the other space. And enhances what I'm trying to do with Walter.
How does it enhance?
Enhance?
Yeah.
Because it's more boundless. It's nothing but something for an audience to walk on.
Right. Right.
It's all it is, and it's all of that. Its existence is completely demanding that you use it. And not necessarily think about it.
Right.
And yet it's an object in the space with some, some high art references and tropes, and so it also takes care of that part of the dialogue and language. But it's, I think, completely accessible. And the efflorescence of Walter is not completely accessible, but is attempting to be inclusive, and inviting. It's attempting to be very generous,
Absolutely.
as well as it can. So I just feel like I want to see more exhibits in spaces like this, because it makes sense to me.
Well, do you see the work evolving further? I mean, this was one stop. It has arrived at this point, but you suggested to me that this will probably keep on evolving.
Oh, this piece?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah, of course. But I see also my passing in and out of these worlds, like this work, coming here to the Walker and being in this gallery space was a great opportunity for this iteration, which I was already working on,
Right.
without
Right.
a home.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? It didn't have a landmark where it was going to end up. So you gave me a portal. It's like, great, perfect timing. But I also see the work cycling back into some kind of stage iteration. And because to me, the whole question is like, where does the form belong?
Right. Right.
And in order for me to really answer that, as honestly as I can, I have to keep it displaced in the way I know spaces and audience. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
What I love about working with Walter is we work in his kitchen or in his bedroom or in his backyard or along some country road or in a Mississippi juke joint. You know, these spaces that are just there, you know, and are very clearly what they are. And I feel a certain amount of freedom and ease, you know, even if I'm dictating, let's go here or let's go there.
Right.
It becomes problematic once they get documented, but still there's a certain amount of you know, of understanding about those placements. And once they become more ensconced in a gallery space or on a stage or in a theater, more questions come up.
Right.
And that's not a bad thing. And I think it's really important for me that happens, but more questions come up. There's less ease. I understand less of it. Like I understand less of being here than I do being in his backyard.
Is there a kind of anti-monumental impulse?
I think there's an anti-audience, anti-monument, anti-look at this and enjoy it, or look at this and don't enjoy it, or look at this and love it, or look at this and hate it. Do you know? It's more complex than that. And maybe the question is, why does one look at something? You know, what is the reason for audience? It's a real big question for me.
And what is it the reason for the creator?
And what is the reason for the creator? You know, and I've heard answers. You know, I have answers, and I've heard answers for those questions, but
right.
I'm not sure if they're really, you know, substantial enough for me now.
Right, right. Well, from my point of view, it is really rewarding and productive to think that, you know, this will have an afterlife which I can't predict. You know, and I think that is just a beautiful way of, now that the exhibition is almost over, that, you know, it's not going to, well, this work was created for this exhibition and it will be exhibited, you know, in a very typical visual arts exhibition kind of a way, that it will have a different life in a collection or in different exhibitions, but then it may very well turn into something that's no longer identifiable for me, you know, which seems to really work well with the whole idea of open-endedness. So,
well, I think from Come Home Charley Patton to this, it's a whole new, it's a completely like different thing.
right.
It's like, what happened? Where's the dancing? Like, where's the props? Where's the performance work? Well, it's there and not.
Right.
And I think the next step for me now is taking this and going back and talking to Walter about it. This is what happened, and this is what people said, and this is how people kind of engaged it. What do you think about that? You know?
Yeah.